Welcome to Crime Time Inc. My name is Alex, and I'm your host for today's episode, episode 19 in our Charles Manson series. In the summer of 1969, Los Angeles was shaken to its core when 5 people, including actress Sharon Tate, were brutally murdered in a Benedict Canyon home. The next night, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca met the same fate. These weren't just murders. They were savage rituals that left investigators scrambling for answers. And when those answers finally came, they were more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. But what happens when the people who hold the keys to solving these brutal crimes are too terrified to speak? That's exactly the challenge prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi faced as he built his case against Charles Manson and his followers. In this episode, we're going to take you behind the scenes of one of the most challenging aspects of the Manson investigation, securing reliable witnesses who lived in constant fear for their lives. Let's start with Dennis Wilson. Yes, that Dennis Wilson. The drummer of the Beach Boys. Few people realize how intimately connected Wilson was to the Manson family before the murders occurred. In fact, Charles Manson and his followers had actually lived in Wilson's home for a period of time. When Bugliosi approached Wilson about testifying, he encountered a rock star paralyzed by fear. And for good reason. Wilson revealed to Bugliosi that his relationship with Manson had soured in August 1969, notably after the Tate murders, when Charles showed up demanding $1,500 to fund a trip to the desert. When Wilson refused, Manson issued a blood-chilling threat. "Don't be surprised if you never see your kid again." Wilson had a 7-year-old son. Let that sink in for a moment. But there was more. During an interview with Wilson and his friend Greg Jacobson, Bugliosi learned of another threat Wilson hadn't even known about. Jacobson revealed that after Wilson's refusal, Manson had handed him a .44 caliber bullet with the message, "Tell Dennis there are more where this came from." Jacobson, trying to protect his friend from further distress, had kept this information to himself. What's particularly striking is how Jacobson described the change in Manson during this period. He said, "The electricity was almost pouring out of him. His hair was on end, his eyes were wild. The only thing I can compare it to is that he was just like an animal in a cage." Bugliosi's investigation revealed something else telling. Phone records from the Spahn Ranch showed that on September 22, 1969, someone called Wilson's private number from the ranch's payphone. The very next day, Wilson had his phone disconnected. When reflecting on his involvement with the family, Wilson told Bugliosi, "I'm the luckiest guy in the world because I got off only losing my money." Money, not his life, not his child's life. That's how real the danger felt. But Wilson wasn't alone in his fear. From rock stars to motorcycle riders to former call girls, every potential witness in the case shared one paralyzing commonality. They feared for their lives. And could you blame them? All they needed to do was turn on the TV or open a newspaper to see that many family members were still free. Steve Grogan, also known as Clem, was out on bail. Bruce Davis had seen charges against him in Inyo County dismissed for lack of evidence. And neither Grogan, Davis, nor anyone else suspected in the decapitation murder of ranch hand Donald Shorty Shea had been charged because there wasn't yet physical proof that Shea was even dead. The witnesses knew too well what the family was capable of. Then came a devastating blow to the prosecution. Susan Atkins, the woman whose confessions had blown the case wide open, suddenly changed course. She called in her attorney, Richard Caballero, and announced that under no circumstances would she testify at trial. And she demanded to see Charlie. Perhaps in her cell at Sybil Brand, Susan Atkins recalled the lyrics of the Beatles song Sexy Sadie. "Sexy Sadie, what have you done? You made a fool of everyone. Sexy Sadie, you broke the rules. You laid it out for all to see. Sexy Sadie, you'll get yours yet, however big you think you are." Caballero delivered the grim news to Bugliosi and his colleague Aaron Stovitz. They had lost their star witness. This is where the prosecution made a pivotal move. They contacted Gary Fleischman, the attorney representing Linda Kasabian, another family member present during the murders, and told him they were ready to talk. Fleischman had been holding out for complete immunity for his client. What Bugliosi didn't know initially was that Linda had been willing to cooperate regardless of immunity. She had even decided to return to California voluntarily against her attorney's advice to fight extradition. After negotiations, they reached an agreement. Linda would receive immunity after testifying, provided she gave a full statement about her involvement in the Tate LaBianca murders and testified truthfully against all defendants. If she refused to testify or lied on the stand, she would face full prosecution. The agreement was signed on February 26, 1970. 2 days later, Bugliosi interviewed Linda Kasabian for the first time. This was a crucial moment, the first time she would discuss the murders with anyone from law enforcement. Bugliosi had preferred Linda over Susan as a witness from the start, even before meeting her. His reasoning was simple. Linda hadn't killed anyone, which would make her far more credible to a jury than the self-confessed killer, Susan Atkins. When he finally met her at Sybil Brand Institute for Women, his instincts were confirmed. Linda was small, with long, light brown hair, bearing a passing resemblance to actress Mia Farrow. Bugliosi found her to be quiet and docile, yet possessing an inner sureness that made her seem much older than her 20 years. Her life story was a tapestry of hardship. The product of a broken home, she'd had 2 failed marriages by age 20 and had a 2-year-old daughter named Tanya. Now 8 months pregnant with another child, she believed it had been conceived during the last time she was with her second husband before joining the Manson family. What struck Bugliosi was Linda's description of her time with the family, just 6 weeks in total, as being like a little blind girl in the forest who took the first path that came to me. Only now, as she spoke about what happened, did she feel she was emerging from that darkness. Linda's life before Manson had been nomadic. On her own since 16, she had wandered from coast to coast, looking for God. Her journey had taken her through communes and crash pads, drug use, and casual sexual encounters with almost anyone who showed interest. She described all this with a candor that shocked even the seasoned prosecutor, yet Bugliosi recognized this honesty would serve her well on the witness stand. From their very first interview, Bugliosi believed Linda's story and felt a jury would too. There were no hesitations in her answers, no evasions, no attempts to appear as something she wasn't. She was brutally frank, even when it painted her in an unflattering light. This was gold for a prosecutor. When a witness takes the stand and tells the truth, even when it damages their own image, they become nearly impossible to impeach. The central question was whether the defense could attack her credibility regarding the events of those 2 murderous nights. Bugliosi knew from that first interview that they couldn't, because she was so obviously telling the truth. Their first interview lasted 3.5 hours, but it was just the beginning. They would have many more, some lasting 6 to 9 hours, all at Sybil Brand, usually with only her attorney present. After each session, Bugliosi would tell Linda that if she remembered anything they hadn't discussed, she should write it down. These notes sometimes became letters to Bugliosi, running a dozen or more pages, all of which would later be made available to the defense. Some attorneys try to minimize pretrial interviews to avoid potential discrepancies that the defense could exploit. Bugliosi took the opposite approach. In his view, if a witness was lying, he wanted to know before they ever took the stand. In more than 50 hours interviewing Linda, he found her occasionally unsure or confused about certain details, but never once did he catch her attempting to lie. And when she was uncertain, she admitted it. While Linda's account of the murders largely matched Susan Atkins' earlier testimony, she delivered several stunning revelations. Before speaking with Linda, the prosecution had assumed she witnessed only one murder, the shooting of Stephen Parent at the Tate residence. Now they learned she had seen much more. Patricia Krenwinkel chasing Abigail Folger across the lawn with an upraised knife, and Charles Tex Watson stabbing Wojtek Frykowski to death. Even more shocking, Linda revealed that on the night the LaBiancas were killed, Manson had attempted to commit 3 additional murders. The prosecution now had what they needed: a credible witness who could place the defendants at the scene of these horrific crimes. But the path forward remained treacherous. Linda Kasabian would have to face not only rigorous cross-examination, but also the penetrating stares of Manson and his followers in the courtroom, the very people she had once considered family and who now viewed her as the ultimate betrayer. Would her testimony hold up under pressure? Could she withstand the psychological warfare that Charles Manson was known to wage even from behind bars? Despite being 9 months pregnant, Linda agreed to visit the murder scenes with Bugliosi, as Susan Atkins had done. While at Cielo Drive, Linda would often start sobbing as recalled the events of that night, and Bugliosi was convinced the tears were genuine. Linda showed Bugliosi roughly where she threw the knives out of the car and remembered one had hit the curb and bounced back onto the road. Later that day, Bugliosi asked Sergeant McGann to get some cadets and search for the knives. From what Linda said, the knives were thrown out of the car after the blood-stained clothes, but before Tex threw out the gun. So the search area was narrowed down to less than 2 miles. The following day, March 4th, Gypsy made another visit to Fleischman's office. She told him, in the presence of his law partner, Ronald Goldman, "If Linda testifies, 30 people are going to do something about it." On March 7th, Linda Kasabian was taken to the hospital. 2 days later, she gave birth to a boy whom she named Angel. On the 13th, she was returned to the jail without the child, Linda's mother having taken him back to New Hampshire. Every few days, Bugliosi called McGann. No, he hadn't got around to looking for the knives yet. Following a meeting with Manson, Susan Atkins fired her lawyer and hired a new one, Day Shin. On leaving the courtroom, Shin told waiting reporters that Susan Atkins definitely will deny everything she told the grand jury. Bugliosi took Kasabian out a number of times looking for and visiting sites that were significant on the night of the LaBianca murders. Bugliosi remarked later, "She never asked for anything. She told me not once but several times that although she was pleased to be getting immunity because it meant that eventually she could be with her children, it didn't matter that much if she didn't get it. She said she knew she had to tell the truth about what had happened, and that she had known she would be the one to tell the story ever since the murders occurred." Unlike the other defendants, she seemed burdened with guilt, though, again unlike them, she hadn't physically harmed anyone. Shortly after the story broke that Linda Kasabian would testify for the prosecution, Al Wyman, the reporter with the Channel 7 crew, which had found the clothing, showed up at Bugliosi's office. If Kasabian was cooperating with them, then she must have indicated where she threw the knives, Wyman surmised. He begged him to pinpoint the area. His station, he promised, would supply a search crew, metal detectors, everything. "Look, Al," he told him, "you guys have already found the clothing. How is it going to look at the trial if you find the knives too? Tell you what, I'm trying to get someone out. If they won't go, then I'll tell you." After Wyman left, 2 weeks had passed since he'd asked McGann to look for the knives. He still hadn't done it. His patience was at an end. He called Lieutenant Helder and told him about Wyman's offer. Think how LAPD is going to look if it comes out during the trial that a 10-year-old boy found the gun and Channel 7 found both the clothing and the knives. Bob Helder had a crew out the next day. No luck. But at least during the trial, we'd be prepared to prove that they had looked. Otherwise, the defense could contend that LAPD was so skeptical of Linda Kasabian's story that they hadn't even bothered to mount a search. That they'd failed to find the knives was a disappointment, but not too much of a surprise. Over 7 months had passed since the night Linda tossed the knives out of the car. According to her testimony, one had bounced back into the road, while the other had landed in the bushes nearby. The street, though in the country, was much traveled. It was quite possible they had been picked up by a motorist or passing cyclist. In the criminal justice system, sometimes the most mundane pieces of evidence, a traffic ticket, an arrest report, can become the critical links that connect a suspect to a crime. Now we're going to see how Bugliosi assembled seemingly insignificant details into an airtight case that would demolish Charles Manson's planned alibi defense. As Bugliosi prepared for trial, he kept two crucial pieces of evidence close to his chest. Both were in the discovery files provided to the defense, buried among hundreds of other documents, but the prosecutor hoped Manson's attorneys wouldn't realize their significance. Together, these two items formed what Bugliosi called a bomb that would demolish Manson's alibi defense. The first was a simple traffic ticket, the second, an arrest report. Separately, they appeared inconsequential. Together, they would prove devastating. Let's rewind to early August 1969, just days before the Tate LaBianca murders would shock the nation. When Bugliosi first learned that Manson might claim he wasn't even in Los Angeles during the murders, he assigned LaBianca detectives Patchett and Gutierrez to investigate Manson's actual whereabouts. Their work would prove invaluable. We'll hear just how valuable their work was after this quick break. Through credit card transactions and witness interviews, the detectives pieced together a detailed timeline of Manson's activities in the week leading up to what he called Helter Skelter, his apocalyptic race war fantasy. On August 1st, 1969, Manson told several family members he was heading to Big Sur to recruit new followers. He apparently left on Sunday morning, August 3rd, purchasing gas in Canoga Park between 7 and 8 a.m. using a stolen credit card. He then headed north toward the coastal community of Big Sur. Around 4 a.m. the next morning, Manson picked up a 17-year-old girl named Stephanie Schram, who was hitchhiking from San Francisco to San Diego. They camped in a nearby canyon that night, where Manson shared his disturbing views on life, love, and especially death, something that deeply frightened the teenager. They took LSD and had sex. Stephanie was unusual in Manson's pantheon of conquests. According to family member Paul Watkins, Manson was unusually smitten with her, telling others that Stephanie, who was of German extraction, represented 2,000 years of perfect breeding. On August 4th and 5th, Manson continued using the stolen credit card, purchasing gas at a place called Lucia. This establishment, which proudly displayed a sign reading "Hippies Not Allowed," was hit twice by Manson, something that must have given him particular satisfaction. On the night of August 5th, Manson and Stephanie drove to what he described as a sensitivity camp, a place where, in his words, rich people went on weekends to play at being enlightened. He was referring to the Esalen Institute, which was just then becoming popular as a growth center, hosting everything from yogis to psychiatrists, salvationists to Satanists. Manson clearly viewed Esalen as a prime venue to promote his philosophies. Taking his guitar, he left Stephanie in their van. When she awoke the next morning, he had returned and was noticeably upset. Later at Barker Ranch, Manson would tell Paul Watkins that at Esalen, he had played his guitar for a bunch of people who were supposed to be the top people there, but they had rejected his music. Some pretended to be asleep, others said his music was too heavy, that they weren't ready for it, or that they simply didn't understand it. Some just got up and walked out. This rejection, occurring just 3 days before the Tate murders, was just the latest in a long line of establishment rebuffs that had fueled Manson's rage. On August 6th, Manson and Stephanie left Big Sur, making gas purchases that day in San Luis Obispo and Chatsworth, just a few miles from Spahn Ranch. According to Stephanie, they had dinner at the ranch that night, where she met the family for the first time. Uncomfortable with the group and learning that Manson shared his sexual favors with other women, Stephanie told him she would only stay if he promised to remain exclusively with her for 2 weeks. Surprisingly, Manson agreed. They spent that night in the van near the ranch. The next day, August 7th, they drove to San Diego to collect Stephanie's belongings. En route, about 10 miles south of Oceanside on Interstate 5, they were stopped by California Highway Patrol officer Richard C. Willis. Though pulled over for a mechanical violation, Manson was cited only for not having a valid driver's license in his possession. This traffic stop would later prove crucial. Officer Willis noted on the ticket that Manson was driving a 1952 cream-colored Ford bakery van, license number K7683. The date was Thursday, August 7, 1969 at 6:15 p.m. This ticket was the first piece of evidence that proved Manson was in Southern California the day before the Tate murders. While Stephanie gathered her clothes, Manson spoke with her sister, who was also a Beatles fan. She owned the White Album, and Manson told her the Beatles had laid out the whole scene in it. He warned that black Americans were preparing to overthrow whites, and only those who fled to the desert and hid in the bottomless pit would survive. For those who remained in cities, Manson made a chilling prediction. People are going to be slaughtered. They'll be lying on their lawns dead. Just over 24 hours later, this grim prophecy would be fulfilled at Cielo Drive with help from his followers. That night, Stephanie and Charlie slept next to their van somewhere in San Diego. The following day, which Stephanie believed was Friday, August 8th, they returned to Spahn Ranch, arriving around 2 p.m. Stephanie's recollection of dates wasn't precise. She thought they returned on Friday, but wasn't certain. Bugliosi anticipated the defense would exploit this uncertainty, but he wasn't concerned. Why? Because that second piece of evidence conclusively placed Manson back at the ranch on Friday, August 8, 1969. According to Linda Kasabian, on the afternoon of August 8th, Manson gave Mary Brunner and Sandra Good a credit card and instructed them to purchase items for him. At 4 p.m. that day, the two women were apprehended, leaving a Sears store in San Fernando after employees discovered the credit card was stolen. The crucial detail? The San Fernando Police Department arrest report stated they were driving a van 1952 Ford license K70683, the exact same vehicle Manson had been driving when ticketed the previous day. Thanks to the La Bianca detectives' thorough investigation, prosecutors now had physical proof that Manson was back at Spahn Ranch on Friday, August 8, 1969, the day before the Tate murders. Though both the traffic ticket and arrest report were included in the discovery materials provided to the defense, they were buried among hundreds of other documents. Bugliosi hoped Manson's attorneys would overlook their common denominator, that vehicle description with its telltale license number. If Manson attempted an alibi defense claiming he was elsewhere during the murders, Bugliosi could prove that alibi was fabricated, strong circumstantial evidence of guilt. Of course, other evidence also placed Manson at Spahn Ranch that day. Linda Kasabian testified that when the family gathered that afternoon, Manson discussed his Big Sur visit, complaining that the people there were really not together. They were just off on their little trips, and that the people wouldn't go on his trip. It was immediately after this that Manson declared, "Now is the time for Helter Skelter." Bugliosi spent many hours interviewing Stephanie Schram, who, along with Kitty Lutzinger, had fled Barker Ranch just hours before the October 1969 police raid. Family member Clem Grogan had pursued them with a shotgun. The prosecutor often wondered what might have happened had the raid been scheduled just one day later, or if Clem had been faster. Unlike Kitty, Stephanie had completely severed ties with the family. Though prosecutors had kept her current address from the defense, Manson followers Squeaky Fromm and Gypsy Cher managed to locate her at a dog grooming school where she worked. "Charlie wants you to come back," they told her. Stephanie's reply was simple, "No thanks." Given what she knew, this refusal showed remarkable courage. From Stephanie, Bugliosi learned something particularly disturbing. While at Barker Ranch, Manson had conducted what she called a murder school. He had given each girl a buck knife and demonstrated how to slit the throats of pigs by yanking the head back by the hair and drawing the knife from ear to ear, using Stephanie herself as a terrified demonstration model. Manson instructed them to stab them in either their ears or eyes, and then wiggle the knife around to get as many vital organs as possible. The details grew even more gruesome. If police came to the desert, they should kill them, cut them into pieces, boil the heads, then display the skulls and uniforms on post to frighten away others. Stephanie had initially told LAPD that Manson spent the nights of Friday, August 8th and Saturday, August 9th with her. But when Bugliosi questioned her more closely, he learned that on August 8th, about an hour after dinner, Manson had taken her to the trailer at Spahn Ranch and told her to go to sleep, promising to join her soon. However, she didn't see him again until shortly before dawn the next morning, the morning after the Tate murders, when he awakened her and took her to Devil's Canyon, a camp across from the ranch. The next night, August 9th, the night of the LaBianca murders, Stephanie recalled, when it got dark, he left and he came back either sometime during the night or early in the morning. If Manson planned to use Stephanie as an alibi witness, Bugliosi was now fully prepared to counter it. Let's have a quick break. As March 1970 progressed, the legal drama continued to unfold in ways that would challenge the prosecution. On March 19th, Manson's court-appointed attorney, Charles Manson, made two motions, requesting a psychiatric examination for Manson and requesting that his case be severed from the other defendants. Manson was furious, attempting to fire Manson on the spot. When asked whom he wished to represent him instead, he replied simply, "Myself." When Judge William Keene denied this request, Manson picked up a copy of the Constitution and, declaring it meant nothing to the court, tossed it into a wastebasket. Manson eventually requested that attorney Ronald Hughes replace Manson. Like several other lawyers in the case, Hughes had been among the first attorneys to visit Manson in jail. He had remained on the periphery ever since, primarily running errands for Manson as one of his designated legal runners. Judge Keene granted the substitution. Manson, described by the press as one of L.A. County's most successful defense attorneys, was out after just 13 days. Hughes, who had never before tried a case, was in. Hughes was an intellectual, a huge, balding man with a long, scraggly beard. His clothing rarely matched and usually displayed numerous food stains. One reporter quipped that you could usually tell what Ron had for breakfast for the past several weeks. Hughes later admitted to Bugliosi that he had purchased his suits for $1 apiece from MGM's Walter Slezak's old wardrobe. The press quickly dubbed him Manson's hippie lawyer. Hughes's first moves were to withdraw both the psychiatric examination and severance motions. His next requests, that Manson be allowed to represent himself and deliver a speech to the court, were denied. Although Manson was displeased with these last two rulings, he couldn't have been too unhappy with his defense team, which now consisted of 4 attorneys: Ira Reiner, representing Leslie Van Houten; Day Shin, representing Susan Atkins; Paul Fitzgerald, representing Patricia Krenwinkel; and Ronald Hughes, representing Manson himself, each of whom had been associated with him since early in the case. What no one knew then was that more changes lay ahead. Among the casualties would be both Reiner and Hughes, each of whom would dare to defy Manson's wishes. While Reiner would lose considerable time and money for his association with the Manson defense, Hughes would pay a far steeper price. Just 8 months later, he would pay with his life. On March 21st, Bugliosi and his co-prosecutor, Aaron Stovitz, were walking down a corridor in the Hall of Justice when they spotted attorney Irving Konorek emerging from an elevator. Though not widely known outside Los Angeles, Konorek was infamous in the local courts. His obstructionist tactics had drawn censure from numerous judges. Stories about Konorek were so outlandish they seemed fictional, though they were actually true. For instance, prosecutor Burton Katz recalled Konorek once objecting to a prosecution witness stating his own name because, having first heard it from his mother, it constituted hearsay. Such frivolous objections were minor irritations compared to his dilatory tactics. In one case, Konorek had stretched a simple $100 theft case, which should have taken hours, into a 3-month ordeal costing taxpayers over $130,000. In another case, he spent 12.5 months on pretrial motions. After spending 2 additional months trying to select a jury, Konorek's own client fired him in frustration. A 1.5 years after Konorek joined the case, not a single witness had been called. In yet another case, Superior Court Judge Raymond Roberts told Konorek, I am doing my best to see that Mr. Bronson gets a fair trial in spite of you. Are you paid by the word or by the hour that you can consume the court's time? You are the most obstructionist man I have ever met." "All we need, Vince," Aaron remarked jokingly to Bugliosi, "is to have Irving Konarek on this case. We'd be in court 10 years. The very next day, Ronald Hughes told a reporter that he may ask Van Nuys attorney I.A. Konarek to enter the case as Manson's lawyer, revealing that he and Manson had conferred with Konarek at the county jail the previous night. Little did Bugliosi know that this chance corridor encounter foreshadowed another dramatic twist in the case. Konarek would indeed join the defense team, becoming a thorn in the prosecution's side with his endless objections and delaying tactics. But would Manson's legal maneuvers ultimately help or hurt his case? And what fate awaited attorney Ronald Hughes, who would later take the bold step of defying his infamous client? Although Charles Manson claimed to be Jesus Christ, it wasn't him that came back from the dead. In the summer of 1969, months before the Tate LaBianca murders shocked the nation, Charles Manson pulled the trigger of a .22 caliber Longhorn revolver, shooting a man he believed was a Black Panther. Manson was convinced he had committed murder that day. He believed his victim had died. But he was wrong on both counts. The man wasn't a Black Panther at all, but rather, in Bugliosi's words, a former dope dealer. And despite what Manson had been led to believe, the man hadn't died. He had survived, with a bullet still lodged perilously close to his spine. His name was Bernard Crowe, though he was better known by his descriptive street name, Lotsapapa. The prosecution team had been searching for Crowe for some time when their break finally came through an unexpected connection. Ed Tolmas, an old acquaintance of Bugliosi who happened to be Crowe's attorney, contacted the prosecutor after learning they were looking for his client. Tolmas arranged a meeting between Bugliosi and the man Manson thought he had killed. During their interview, Crowe revealed what had happened after Manson and a family member known as TJ fled the Hollywood apartment where the shooting occurred. Crowe, who had been playing dead, instructed his friends to call an ambulance. They did, and then promptly disappeared. When questioned by police at the hospital, Crowe claimed ignorance. He said he didn't know who had shot him or why. His survival had been far from certain. He remained on the critical list for 18 days. And when he spoke with Bugliosi months later, the bullet remained lodged next to his spine, a permanent souvenir of his encounter with Charles Manson. For Bugliosi, Crowe's testimony was valuable for two critical reasons. First, it proved conclusively that Charles Manson was personally capable of shooting someone, information that could be crucial during the penalty phase of the trial, when evidence of other crimes could be introduced. Second, and perhaps more importantly, from Crowe's description, it appeared that the weapon Manson had used was the same .22 caliber Longhorn revolver that Tex Watson would later use in the Tate murders. If they could somehow extract the bullet from Crowe's body and match it to test fires from the recovered murder weapon, they would have placed the Tate murder weapon directly in Manson's hand, a potentially devastating piece of evidence. Bugliosi consulted with Sergeant Bill Lee of the Scientific Investigation Division about the feasibility of matching the bullet. Lee wasn't optimistic. After being embedded in human tissue for over 9 months, the bullet's distinctive markings, the striations that make ballistic matching possible, had likely been degraded by bodily acids. A positive identification would be difficult, though not impossible. The prosecutor then spoke with several surgeons. They confirmed they could extract the bullet at Los Angeles County Hospital, but warned that the operation carried serious risks. When Bugliosi presented this option to Crowe, he didn't sugarcoat the dangers. After considering the request, Crowe declined. With a touch of macabre pride, he told Bugliosi that the bullet made quite a conversation piece. Eventually, Manson would have learned about Crowe's survival through the legal discovery process. But fate arranged a more dramatic revelation. Crowe was later jailed on a marijuana charge. As he was being escorted down a hallway, he passed Manson, who was returning from the attorney room with his guard. Upon seeing the man he thought he'd killed, Manson did a quick about-face and said, according to deputies who witnessed the encounter, "Sorry I had to do it, but you know how it is." Whether Crowe responded went unrecorded. One can only imagine the shock on Manson's face at seeing this ghost from his past. Toward the end of March 1970, as the case against Manson continued to build, the prosecution nearly lost another key witness under suspicious circumstances. Paul Watkins, once Manson's chief lieutenant, who had since turned against him, was pulled from a burning Volkswagen camper and rushed to Los Angeles County General Hospital. He suffered second-degree burns on 25% of his face, arms, and back. When he recovered enough to speak with police, Watkins offered uncertain explanations for the fire. He suggested he might have fallen asleep while reading by candlelight, or perhaps a marijuana cigarette he'd been smoking had caused the blaze. But these were merely guesses. Watkins admitted he was unsure of the origin of the blaze. What makes this incident particularly disturbing is that just 3 days before the fire, Inyo County authorities had received information that Watkins was going to be killed by the family. Was this a coincidence? Or had the family attempted to silence another potential witness? Bugliosi had long feared such retribution. As far back as November 1969, he had repeatedly requested that the Los Angeles Police Department infiltrate the Manson family. The prosecutor wasn't just concerned about gathering intelligence on their defense strategy, he was genuinely worried about preventing further violence. It would be tragic, Bugliosi told LAPD officers, if there was another murder which we could have prevented. Despite making this request at least 10 times, LAPD consistently refused. Their objection? If they planted an undercover agent in the family, that agent would have to commit crimes, like smoking marijuana to maintain their cover. Bugliosi countered that, for an act to be considered criminal, there must be criminal intent. An officer participating in illegal activities solely to maintain his cover and catch dangerous criminals wouldn't actually be committing crimes in the legal sense. When police continued to resist this reasoning, Bugliosi suggested they didn't even need to use an actual officer. He pointed out that law enforcement regularly employed paid informants in narcotics, gambling, and even prostitution cases. Surely, he argued, they could find someone to infiltrate what was arguably one of the most significant murder cases of the century. Still, LAPD refused. Finally, Bugliosi turned to the District Attorney's Bureau of Investigation, which managed to find a young man willing to take on this dangerous assignment. While Bugliosi admired the volunteer's courage, he quickly realized the plan was doomed. The young man was clean-cut with short hair and had an unmistakably straight-laced appearance, sending him into what Bugliosi called that den of killers would be a death sentence. After the family stopped laughing at this obvious infiltration attempt, Bugliosi feared they would chop him to pieces. With great reluctance, Bugliosi abandoned the idea. The prosecution would have to proceed without inside information about what the family might be planning next. Throughout the Manson case, danger constantly lurked on the periphery. The resurrection of Bernard Crowe, the man who didn't die, provided crucial insight into Charles Manson's capacity for violence. But it also highlighted the persistent challenge facing Bugliosi and his team, building a case when potential witnesses lived in fear and key sources of information remained elusive or under threat. As the prosecution prepared for trial, one question loomed. Would they be able to protect their witnesses long enough to secure justice? Or would the family find ways to silence those who dared to speak against them? After this quick break, we'll hear from our two crime experts, Simon and Tom.
Thanks again, Alex. You've done it again. Episode 19, absolutely amazing, fascinating, because one of the things I'm always interested in is the building of the case. I think too often ex-detectives and cops just do their work and pass it on to the prosecution and don't actually give too much thought to the difficulties and problems they may have. We're very quick to criticise, but we don't often understand. And I think you're giving a real insight here. and they found it fascinating. Simon, how did you get on with episode 19? What did you think?
Just like you, Tom, I found it fascinating. I can see where we're going here towards the trial. You're absolutely right. It's something that we all took a bit for granted. But there's a thing called court strategy. And I've seen it with defence lawyers too. People forget that when you make a decision as a prosecutor or a defence lawyer, you're stuck with that decision. You can't unsay anything. Sometimes you can't bring into evidence something that you chose not to bring in. There must be hundreds of decisions made during the course of a high court trial that can't be changed. Those decisions are critical, either to the Crown case or to your client's future and the case as a whole. So the whole thing is fascinating. The first thing that I wrote down here was the witness intimidation, because we've both come across this during our careers. And Dennis Wilson's comment was very revealing, wasn't it, of the Beach Boys. He only lost money. I just thought it was quite telling.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too. And it reminded me that the vulnerability of witnesses is not always the obvious vulnerability. We think of vulnerable people as people who are weak, people who have no leverage, have no status in society. But I remember many years ago when I was a detective sergeant getting a rape case to investigate, and the victim was a rising star in musical comedy. Very feisty, very intelligent, very confident young woman. She went on to be a big star. She was the very opposite of vulnerable as I thought it. And speaking to her, she said she wasn't frightened about the accused or the suspect coming back to attack her. She was frightened for her reputation. She was fighting for her professional reputation, that somehow she would be stigmatised as being a victim, and she did not want to be a victim. She did not want to be perceived to be a victim. And so vulnerability comes in different shapes and forms. And I was thinking of that when I was hearing from Alex about Dennis Wilson.
I was thinking along the same lines, but again, a different kind of vulnerability, Tom.
Yeah.
I remember catching a predator, for want of a better word, and he had hundreds of cases that were being rolled up against him, not just in the UK, across the continent. Some of these cases by nature were historical. They were over a period of 3, 4 or 5 years. And a lot of the witnesses who had been able to identify him had given good statements at the time of the incident. They were unwilling to come forward and take any part in the case 2, 3 or 4 or 5 years later, because they had lives now. They had husbands, they had children, they had moved on in every sense of the word, and they were vulnerable to reopening all of that again. It would bring up things that they'd moved on from in their lives. As you say, there's lots of different aspects to that. The more obvious one, of course, is threats. We've both seen that in cases. I was involved heavily with witness protection for a while as well, because these threats are real, especially in organised crime when the stakes are so high.
It was interesting. I remember a historic predator, a rapist, speaking to a woman he had undoubtedly raped about 5 years before. And she said, "I'm over this now. I've moved on from it. I don't want to go back." And that was just exactly what you're saying. But the other thing I liked about this episode was Bugliosi's tactics of minimal interviews. You minimise the interviews so you don't have to make disclosure to the defence, so you can keep your cards close to your chest. I thought that was pretty good. I'll tell you what, we could do with a few prosecutors like Bugliosi over this side of the Atlantic.
Yeah, for sure. Interviewers, Tom, it's a real art interviewing people and not jumping in right at the start with all your cards, putting them on the table and saying, "What do you think of that?"
Oh, I know.
Because
in my very early days in the police service, interviewing was at a lower level. For low-level crime was very poor. It was, you did, no, I didn't, you did. That was about it, really. But there is a real craft in interviewing. And of course now, people go on long and very complicated courses to learn proper interviewing. I've heard some of them at work. It's very impressive.
Yeah, it really is a science. It's an art form even.
One of the critical things I thought about this particular episode is Bugliosi having to decide who he was going to use as the main witness, whether it be Linda or whether it be Susan. And the pros and cons of using Susan, who is a self-admitted killer, or Linda Kasabian, who is a cleaner tatty, as we would say here in Scotland.
She hadn't killed anyone.
Right, uniquely amongst that crowd, she didn't kill anybody. It's a really risky part of the deal, because if these people are put up as being the mainstay of the case, the prime Crown witness, as we would call the prosecution witness in America, and then they change their mind or they fudge their statement, then everything falls from it. This is really critical decision time from Bugliosi.
It was a very frustrating part of the process for me anyway, Tom, that usually it was me as the reporting officer who had interacted with the main witnesses, who'd got their statements, who'd maybe got them on tape or recorded and signed or whatever it was that I'd done to secure them. But you go to court, and because usually I've given my evidence first, maybe, but not before the civilian witnesses. The civilian witnesses would go in first. And you had no idea, because you're not allowed in the court. We're sitting in a witness room, and you had no idea what they said, whether they came across with the vital points, whether the fiscal, the Crown Advocate, understood the nuances of the case to bring out the evidence that you knew was crucial, and whether they'd broken down under cross-examination. You were blind to that by the time you went into the witness box.
I know, and it was always that added to the nerves in the High Court.
Yeah.
I think it was because of the grandeur of the High Court. I remember one awful experience I had. I was sitting in the witness room at the High Court. It was an armed robbery. Unusually, it wasn't some of your guys, it was some of our own guys. But anyway, this armed robbery, we got statements from members of the family of one of the accused. It was controversial. Anyway, I'm waiting there, but there's witnesses before me, but all of a sudden the usher comes through, the detective inspector would come into the court, and I was shown into the court. Come into the well of the court. I came in, stand in the well of the court for the judge and the jury. The judge said to the witness, "Is this the man?" And the witness says, "Yes, that's him." Thank you very much, Inspector. You may return to the witness room. Jesus Christ. Oh, my God. As it turned out, you can imagine how I was feeling sitting back in the witness room. What is going on there? But actually, it was quite simple. There was confusion about who he'd spoken to because it was myself and another officer doing it. It was for clarification. But I've always remember an old inspector I worked with. He said, in the High Court, he said, the sweetest words you will ever hear are, "You're free to go."
Isn't that the truth?
Isn't that the truth? It doesn't matter. And
I've seen me coming out of there rate of knots as well.
I was actually in the High Court in Aberdeen last year, believe it or not.
That's right.
First had taken in a case way back in the 1970s. And what was interesting was that everybody who I'd interviewed had subsequently died of natural causes, I have to state. But anyway, so I was in reading his statements, and it was completely non-controversial. There was no issues at all. I wasn't cross-examined at all. Maybe one or two questions, but nothing controversial. But you know what? When the judge said, "Mr. Wood, you're free to go," and I walked out, the air always smells sweeter. Isn't it funny?
Yeah, and it's so true. That's why it's funny. I was going to mention precognitions, because that's what a lot of this has got to do with. When I left the police, I did some precognition work, and for the Crown as well. But I remember a Crown agent saying to me once, "Simon, I never want to ask a question in court, especially the High Court, that I don't know the answer to. So we really rely on the precognitions to give us the information we need before you ask a question. Nobody wants anything to change course once you're in there, you know." And that was the problem here, that Vincent had no idea what these women were going to come out with when it all came down to it.
And the most recent time I saw that in action was the trial of Angus Sinclair, the World's End murderer, that some people will know I've written a book about. At the last minute, he decided to give evidence on his own behalf. Now, that throws a complete blinder, because the prosecution have no idea what he's going to say. There can be no preparation for that. It was completely against the run of play. It was completely unexpected. I've got to say, Frank Mulholland, the Lord Advocate, now High Court judge, handled it like the master he is. It was fantastic. And at the end of the day, if there was any doubt about Sinclair's guilt, giving him his own evidence, I removed it completely. But I remember when it was declared in the court he would give evidence, I remember looking across at Frank Mulholland, the Lord Advocate, and seeing him, and I could just see that flicker in his eyes, saying, "This is something I'm not prepared for." These are questions to which I do not know the answers. So one of the things that still fascinates me here, Simon, this whole thing, is about the searches. And clearly we're talking about 1969, but clearly there is no system for searching, and there is no training for searching, and there is no search team. There's nothing. It reminded me very much of a case I'm familiar with, the Ruxton case, which happened in 1935. I've mentioned it once or twice before, I think, on this podcast, that even in 1935, Lanarkshire County Constabulary had a group of people called police firemen. They acted as both police officers and firemen, but they were search trained. They were properly search trained in 1935, and they were equipped because, of course, being firemen, they had protective clothing. And there was access to packs of bloodhounds for searching as well. Actually, then they actually deployed them at Moffat during the Ruxton inquiry. And that was 30 years before. So I find it inconceivable, because in episode 19, Alex talks about them mustering some police cadets to do a ground search for the knife, for the murder weapon. And you can just imagine this, mustering some cadets, minimal or no training, and just told, just hop over that fence and have a look and see if you can find a knife. It's absolutely remarkable how poorly they were trained and equipped, even for 69.
I saw something on the news recently, Tom. There's a boy missing since the start of May this year. They were getting volunteers. I know it's a different thing from what you're talking about, but from what they showed on television, I don't imagine for a minute that's what was going on. There would have been somebody supervising, but it looked like people going for a walk with their dogs down pathways. It didn't look as though there was a systematic search going on. And you and I both know how important that training is, because searching is a real skill. It's a real team skill. It's something that needs to be led properly and managed properly and recorded, every inch of it properly. Sometimes you don't really know what you're looking for. You're looking for a clue, but that clue could be anything at all. It could be a piece of litter. It could be anything. So you're absolutely right. This seems like we probably need to blame my old Chief Constable for 1935.
Yeah, Sillitoe, yes, it was him, and all credit to him. I think the greatest Chief Constable that Scotland has ever had, and certainly one of the greatest forward-thinking police officers that Britain has ever had. Absolutely, yes, it was him that put that together. But talking about public searches, Simon, reminds me, during the Robert Black case, when Caroline Hogg, the wee 5-year-old Caroline, went missing in the summer of 83 from Portobello Promenade, there was a huge upswell of public concern, and hundreds of people turned up at Portobello Town Hall to take part in searches. It became a problem in itself because, as you say, searches have got to be carried out on a very tight sector, on a grid reference, to make sure nothing is missed, and it's got to be done by properly trained officers and dogs. But at the same time, we had this huge upswell of public support, and they had to be put to use. What we couldn't do is we couldn't say, we don't need you, go home. And so what we did, it was Stuart Henderson, actually, who was a colleague of mine at the time, he was a DI in the Serious Crime Squad, went on to become an SIO at Lockerbie, latterly. Stuart, great guy, great detective. And he actually said, right, we'll use these people. We put them all on a line and had them search a golf course.
Right.
Now, so there was no connection whatsoever, and we had no expectation of finding anything, but it put them to use.
Yes.
And it did two things. It harnessed their energies. It made sure we were making best use of this support for the police, which was very important. At the same time, it was minimising the chance of any foul-ups. Areas where we really did want to search was down and around the promenade and near Beach Lane and these places.
And of course, it helped the media get some footage.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and we can send the media up there as well, so we can keep the story running. We can keep the public on board, but at the same time, we can make sure it's not injurious to the actual investigation.
I should say here that Caroline Hogg, you mentioned there, part of the Robert Black inquiry, Percy Sillitoe, greatest Chief Constable, as you say, these are covered in previous broadcasts and previous seasons extensively. six-parters, and they're absolutely fascinating. All the information you would ever need is there contained, just for anyone that's needing to catch up with some old episodes and series of Crime Time Inc.
They are indeed. They're covered, and they're such important characters and stories that I suspect we'll hear more about them. But I want to move on, Simon, because something here really struck a chord with me. The first mistake, I think, or mistake I perceive that Bugliosi makes is he wants to put an insider, he wants to put an undercover guy into anything. And I thought to myself, what are you doing, Bugliosi? Because he's going to walk right into the trap of agent provocateur, isn't he? You know? Then he picks someone who is straight-laced and, a collar and tie, clean-cut sort of guy, a bit like myself, where he should have been picking someone like you.
Exactly.
He should have been picking somebody who
hippie.
looks scruffy.
An aging hippie.
You wouldn't mean aging then, but scruffy, dirty, a kind of sort of moral degenerate sort of person that would have fitted in. You, Simon, would have fitted in perfectly.
Yep, I'd have been one of the family.
It would have been, particularly with all the drugs and free sex. You certainly would, boy.
You know me so well.
Yeah, but it's the first wrong step that I've seen Bugliosi make. And of course, we're talking about different jurisdictions with different rules over there, not the same thing about entrapment and things like that. But I just wonder, what is he thinking about? I suppose what it indicated was he was desperate for evidence.
Another surprise of it, Tom, was that the police refused on numerous occasions to do it. It seemed that it was the only decent decisions they made in this case, was not to do it. But I suppose we need to take into consideration 1969, what's going on in California at that time, the environment that we're in. There probably were undercovers. In fact, I know that there were from other stories about that time who were infiltrating communes and drug supply lines, but they would be doing so at a much lower level. Like you're saying, I would have fitted in. I would have fitted in to a degree, but not with something like this, with Manson. You could never put an undercover in where they were probably going to be tested by having to do something horrific in the first place just to get in the door. There was a madness here that no undercover could penetrate unless you'd been there right from the very start.
I think you do yourself a great disservice. I still think you'd have fitted in perfectly.
Well, we'll never know.
You never know whether that was a compliment or not.
Just to finish up with that episode for me, Tom, the other wee thing that I'd picked up on was the attention to detail. Because I had a case like this as well where a parking ticket had blown an alibi. And it was similar here. It shows the benefit of an investigator. I used to say to guys all the time, don't take that as a negative interview. It's a good interview if you get them to speak at all. If you get them to tell you anything whatsoever, these are all details that we can check and double check. It's on tape. And if we disprove anything at all, we can discredit him completely. It was a parking ticket here, wasn't it? That he had given an alibi. Charlie made a mistake by giving an alibi that couldn't stand up.
Yeah, and of course, coming back to our previous reference to the Robert Black case, that in the end of the day is what convicted him. Not parking tickets as much as receipts, and also petrol receipts, shop receipts, which actually showed him to be in the right place at the right time in the cases of the abductions and murders which he was subsequently convicted of. And that kind of hard evidence is very, very compelling on a jury. It really is. But people can relate to that. If they're suspicious of police interviews and admissions, they can relate to that. It makes sense to them. It adds up. That here's a parking ticket for a hamburger he bought, and it happens to be right next door at the same time as a wee girl's abducted. Bingo. You've got some good evidence.
Tom, I think we'll move on because episode 20 takes us further on towards the trial. The research involved is incredible. They really are doing a fantastic job. And there's lots of avenues that we could go down discussing this, but we'd be here all night.
Looking forward to chapter 20. Alex, first class job again.